Hey everyone, we're here for another quick conversation for the long haul of leadership with Tod Bolsinger. And we're discussing a quote today from episode 242 titled Life and Leadership in the Fog. This is from Michaela O'Donnell. And here's what she said. The world is moving fast. Change is speeding up, and human brains haven't necessarily changed in order to be able to cope with all that's happening. One more time. The world is moving fast. Change is speeding up, and human brains haven't necessarily changed in order to be able to cope with all that's happening. So, Tod, change leadership. This is kind of right up your alley. What do you think about this? How do you think about this?
Yeah. So for one thing, I really appreciate Michaela saying this because she is one of the actually best adaptive leaders I know. And she and I have talked about this a lot. She teaches on this. She understands this material. She's a genuine expert in this. And one of the parts she does in her work, and especially in her books, is helps people realize that the first thing a leader needs to do when they're overwhelmed is stop and acknowledge that they're overwhelmed. She's got these great metaphors about how when the boat's taken on water, you don't just keep paddling. And if you feel like life is in flux and it's chaotic, you don't just keep going. Like, she's really mature and really insightful about saying, hey, when things speed up, you're going to need to slow down. And your brain doesn't have an instant solution. You're not an expert. So this is really where you start practicing adaptive leadership, like where you get curious and you acknowledge that you're overwhelmed, you get honest, and you slow the process down and start reflecting. And so she's really, and she's given us a really beautiful quote about the experience of leading adaptive change.
Yeah. I appreciate you kind of talking about slowing down, because I think when we experience lots of change very quickly, our natural response is to become really anxious about it. Maybe let's talk about that. Okay, if we don't slow down, if we don't kind of take a step back, as you were saying, and we start by becoming anxious, how does that affect? If we're okay, and let's talk about a situation of change in a congregation, which is what we talk about here. How does that impact this particular situation, whatever that might be? If we start with anxiety.
Yeah. So in my little book, How Not to Waste a Crisis, one of the things I say is, I quote, one of my mentors who taught me, at the moment of crisis, you do not rise the occasion, you default to your training. So what you'll do is you'll do what your brain has been trained to do. So what you'll do is when you're overwhelmed, you'll do what you've always done. So think about this. When you teach a kid to drive, you probably taught your teenagers to drive. I had to teach mine. One of the first things to teach them is when the car goes out into a skid, they got to learn to turn into the skid. That's so counterintuitive. Everything about you feels like I want to turn the other way. You have to actually train them that if the car goes out of control, you turn into the skid in order to bring control. Well, that's training. So one of the things we teach a lot is don't just do something, stand there. Like, our little brains say, don't just stand there, do something. Right? We want to do the other. Don't just do something, stand there just a second and ask, what is it I need to do in this moment? And that pause, that can just be a few seconds, or it might be a longer time, can actually help us not just default back to old practices that probably won't work in this rapidly changing world.
And so in that pause, what are we doing? Are we asking ourselves questions? Are we just kind of taking stock? Are we observing? Maybe it's the balcony. We're getting on the balcony. What are we doing in that pause?
Yeah, all the above. Like, we do a lot of talk. That's where we teach people about the balcony session, right? So if you're in the swirl of a dance floor that's got a lot of energy, and all of a sudden it's speeding up, the song's speeding up, and it feels like you got nothing but bodies crashing into you, and it smells like Axe body spray, and it's like, if you get out of that and get above it, you can actually see the rhythm a little bit more. You can see what's going on. And I was talking to a leader today. I'm living in New York at the moment, and I was talking to a leader who's here in New York City. Talk about a very chaotic, busy place. And one of the things she realized is she needed to teach her congregation and her leaders that when they get, the more chaotic things get, the more they just need to pause and pray. And what she meant was pray silently. Like, gather together, quiet ourselves, and just even ask the question, oh Lord, what then shall we do? And she said, it's amazing how often there's just a piece falls over us and we go, okay, we know we have to do something, but could we just pause? And it could be as simple as get on the balcony and get perspective, pause and say a prayer, listen, get some input. One of the best things you can do is ask the question, so the world's going really fast. When do I have to make this decision? Do I need to make it right now? Maybe I can make it tomorrow and I have a night to sleep on it, right? Like there's things like that that are just acknowledging that we're working at a pace that is probably so fast that causes us to default back to old best practices rather than consider new things to do is probably the beginning of wisdom.
Yeah, that's so good. Here's the quote one more time from Michaela O'Donnell. She said, "The world is moving fast. Change is speeding up, and human brains haven't necessarily changed in order to be able to cope with all that's happening."